Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us. Would normally be our scholars and scones. So we have scholars. I don't have any scones, but I do have some coffee. I hope y'all have something to snack on here. So it's kind of like we're together in this fellowship of learning and eating together. And today we're going to have a fun story about local history, a bit of Blowing Rock history that I didn't know about before. And something that I'm calling the wild and wonderful tales of Robert O. Colt in Blowing Rock. So this is some fun research that Eric has done with Digital Watauga that he's going to share with us today. So during the early decades of the 20th century, stories abounded that Robert O. Colt, allegedly a son or nephew of Samuel Colt of Colt revolver fame, was a frequent visitor and sometime resident of Blowing Rock. Some stories even claimed that Robert Colt shot his own child during a party at his home near Cone Manor. To this day, such myths continue to percolate in the lore of the Cone estate and nearby Blowing Rock. Want to know the real story? If liquor, gunplay, and run-ins with the law are your kind of thing, well, don't miss this discussion we're about to have. So we've got Dr. Eric Plaag from the Digital Watauga Project, and he is going to share some historical sources and help us on our journey to find the truth. So Dr. Eric Plaag is the principal consultant at the Carolina Historical Consulting LLC and also serves as chairperson of the Boone Historic Preservation Commission and the chairperson of the Digital Watauga Project. He earned his doctorate in American history with a specialization in historic preservation at the University of South Carolina in 2006. And he has been instrumental in a number of preservation efforts throughout the Carolinas in general and Watauga County in particular. And he has been a member of the High Country community since 2011. And just to let y'all know a little bit about Digital Watauga, the principal aim of the Digital Watauga Project is the digital preservation of Watauga County, North Carolina's historical images, documents, and other materials. By serving as a digital clearinghouse of Watauga County's history, the Digital Watauga Project encourages its members and the citizens of Watauga County to make our history more accessible to the general public, while also allowing the owner of historical materials digitized through the Digital Watauga Project to retain ownership and control over their original images, documents, and artifacts. In addition, the Digital Watauga Project sponsors regular public events designed to highlight components of its digital collection and educate the Watauga County community about its rich, multifaceted, and important history. The Digital Watauga Project, working in partnership with the Watauga County Public Library, is a project of the Watauga County Historical Society and a 501c nonprofit organization. So really fortunate to have Dr. Eric Plaag here today to share with us some of the fun history of Blowing Rock. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Plaag.
Thanks, Willard. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. So I want to draw your attention to this headline in the middle of the landing page for this presentation. Miss Colt did not shoot at the cat with a Colt's revolver. This headline always cracks me up, and I've probably seen this headline about 400 times over the last 2 years. But now that I've intrigued you with it, I want to tell you a little bit about that absurd headline and how we got to here. I promise that we will return to that headline, by the way. But just about 2 years ago today, a family that owns this house on Chestnut Circle in Blowing Rock hired me to do a house history on their property. The story they had heard was that the house had once been the home of a descendant, perhaps a son or a nephew of Samuel Colt, the infamous inventor of the Colt revolver, and they wanted to know a bit more about this connection. They'd heard some other stories too, something about a murder and some sort of dispute with Moses Cone. They were a little evasive on these points, but they wanted to see what I could dig up. These, of course, are the best kinds of projects, a paying gig with a mystery at its core. So I naturally took on the assignment. Our focus today will not be on the house so much, although I'll eventually explain the Colt connection to the house, but instead on the legend long associated with this house and the Colt family. I'll show you what is and isn't true, and along the way, I hope you'll see the importance of vetting your sources when you're doing historical research, as well as the many tools and resources that need to be used to get to the heart of good history. So when I started the project, I plunged headlong into the usual local sources and found several references to these tales. Bud Altmaier, for example, once wrote in his Blowing Rocket column, The Way It Is, quote, "An incident concerning the Colt firearms family whose summer home bordered the estate is interesting. The Colts held different mores from the Cones, often throwing wild parties and disrupting the peace and harmony of the estate. Also particularly distressing was the fact that a Colt child died mysteriously in the house, perhaps in connection with a party," close quote. Altmaier unfortunately cited no sources, so I was left having to dig elsewhere. I figured that maybe the Appalachian collection might have something, so I dug deeper. Sure enough, buried in an August 1975 interview with Ted Pease, the longtime landscape architect at Cone Manor, was this nugget. Dee Shoemake, I guess Dee's retired now, was more or less raised on the Cone place. His daddy worked over there, and I think Dee told me that this Colt was either Samuel or a brother of his, the pistol Colt. But it was that family anyway. But they were there before Cone bought the property. He got the property, as I understand it. They reserved a lifelong tenancy there or whatever they wanted. But then later on, Colt and Mr. Cone fell out over his still. Colt, he had a legal still in there. I presume it was a small operation, but I understand that he and Mr. Cone fell out about that, and I think that Cone bought out the tenancy there and just got it all out altogether. There is supposed to be one of the Colt children buried around there, but I don't know where. Pease was interviewed again 5 years later, and this time his memory had miraculously improved. He knew all the details, but when pressed about how the child died, he demurred. Pease said, "Well, they had a sheep barn on Rich Mountain. Now, the Colt house there was one that was not built by Cones. This was the Colt gun people." The interviewer asked, why did they get there? Pease, "I don't know unless they just came in for the summer home. And one of the Colt children died there, is buried out behind the house. The grave isn't marked, but it is out there. Clyde Downs says he used to know where it was and tried to tell me one time he wanted to arrange to mark it." Carl Hollers, one of Pease's co-workers, was also interviewed in 1975. He had worked for 2 decades on the Cone estate, and he said, quote, "They said something about it, but I never did hear them say on what happened. It might have been one of them big time parties they were having," close quote. So this all culminated, despite this lack of details, in a report authored by Barry M. Buxton, executive director of the Appalachian Consortium, who apparently let his imagination carry him further than what Pease and Hollers had offered when he authored an official historic resource study in 1987 that was later signed off on by both the Blue Ridge Parkway superintendent and the Southeast Regional Director of the National Park Service. Without citing a single source, Buxton wrote the following: "Anything which threatened or disrupted community norms prompted a strong reaction from the Cone family. Such was their reaction to the Colt family, Mr. Colt of Colt revolvers, who was leasing some land on the west side of Trout Lake. Mr. Colt had built a still on the spring that fed the lake. His property was the site of many wild parties. In fact, one of Mr. Colt's own sons was shot in the head during one of these parties. Moses Cone insisted that the Colts relocate, and they acquiesced. This incident is representative of the seriousness with which Moses and Bertha Cone regarded their responsibility to the community," close quote. As we shall see, almost nothing that Altmaier, Pease, Hollers, or Buxton had said about the Colt family was actually true. And yet the actual story is in some respects far, far stranger. So to get at that truth, we need to know a little bit about our players, and our key figure is Robert Colt II. To begin to understand that relationship between Robert Colt II and Samuel Colt, the infamous inventor of the Colt revolver, I needed to build a family tree. And as it turns out, Robert Oliver Colt II, born in 1860 in New York, was not a nephew or son of Samuel Colt. At best, he can be described as a distant cousin, or at least a second cousin once removed. Newspaper articles from the late 1800s and early 1900s abound with speculation about the relationship between the two men, which was no doubt enhanced by Robert O. Colt II's frequent reference to himself as Colonel Colt, even though he actually had no record of military service. But Colt had been to military boarding school, as this 1877 roster of students from the Alexander Institute in White Plains, New York demonstrates. Colt's brother Craig was also there at the same time, and you can see his name listed there. Given Colt's later reputation for stretching the truth, it's quite believable that Colt adopted the colonel label simply because he felt it suited him. Another myth surrounding Colt was the claim that his fortune was derived from Samuel Colt or Colt manufacturing in some way. None of this was true. Indeed, Colt's grandfather, Roswell Lyman Colt, born 1779, died 1856, had run a successful West Indies shipping business of his own for decades and served as director of both the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the Baltimore and Port Deposit Railroad. His greatest claim to fame was probably his role in founding and establishing the city of Paterson, New Jersey, and he served for many years as governor of the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, an exceedingly important position during the mid-19th century. At the time of Colt's death, and in this case I'm talking about Roswell Colt, he was regarded nationally as the greatest of all Colts, even surpassing in reputation Samuel Colt. So why would Robert O. Colt have preferred his distant cousin's reputation over his own grandfather's? Quite likely it's because he may have actually hated his grandfather, a man he had never met. When Roswell Colt first moved to the Paterson area to establish the new city, his wife, Margaret Oliver Colt, refused to accompany him. Fearing scandal over their permanent separation, Roswell tried to hide that and concocted a scheme that allowed him to divide the rest of his own family. Roswell kept 4 of his own children with him and sent the other 5 to live with his wife. He also decreed that Roswell's fortune would never descend to the 5 children sent to live with Margaret. Instead, their inheritance would come from Margaret herself, who had to depend instead on the large trust that her father had established at his death for Margaret's benefit. Margaret's father was Robert Oliver, a wealthy Baltimore merchant, and one of her children sent to live with her was Robert O. Colt Sr., father of Robert O. Colt II. How do we know this? Because Roswell Colt's will tells us so, and that's the highlighted portion you see here on the screen. It's not hard to imagine Robert O. Colt II wanting no claim or association with the grandfather who had once abandoned his own father. And in some ways, I imagine that Samuel Colt made for a more interesting story. So again, who was Robert Colt? We now know Robert Colt's family background and a little about where his money came from. I'll add that Colt's father, Robert O. Colt Sr., had himself been quite successful, serving in the Mexican War under General Winfield Scott, working as one of the directors of the South Side Railroad Company of Long Island, and nearly completing a round-the-world trip at the time of his death in 1885. He was described as a millionaire at the time of his death, a considerable fortune for 1885 that presumably was shared among his 4 surviving children. We know little about Robert O. Colt II's life between 1877 and his father's death in 1885, but shortly thereafter there were signs of trouble. As I've written elsewhere, it's likely that Colt was something of a cheat, probably a drunkard, perhaps a cad, and definitely a teller of grand tales. By early 1887, he was conducting a truck farming business in Norfolk, Virginia, but was also facing local charges for drunkenness. And he even spent 15 days in jail for failure to pay the $3 fine on that drunkenness charge. In May 1888, he acquired a marriage license at Norfolk to marry Helen Williams, who later press accounts indicated was from Galveston, Texas, but was also a lineal descendant of John Hancock. The Colts appear to have moved frequently between his father's house at Babylon, Long Island, and a residence at Norfolk. Colt himself was described in 1890 by the Babylon Press as, quote, probably the wealthiest man in the place. But Colt's troubles continued. During one of he and his wife's visits to Babylon in September of 1890, Colt was arrested for inexplicably assaulting a local pharmacist while in a, quote, hilarious mood, close quote, probably a euphemism for drunkenness. During these years moving between Norfolk and Babylon, Robert and Helen had a total of 4 children: Robert O. Colt III, born in 1889, Helen Williams Colt, born in 1891, Hannah Fitchett Colt, born in 1893, and Amy Colt, born in 1894. In September 1894, news broke of the death of their 3rd child, Hannah. The Colts then elected to winter at the Beaufort House in Charlotte for a change, prompting local press to speculate that they might move there permanently. In October 1895, the Colts sold their property at Babylon and continued to reside at the Beaufort House for several years. But by May 1896, press reports claimed that Colt had purchased 1,000 acres of land from Moses Cone near Blowing Rock for stock raising, a transaction for which no deed appears to survive. 4 months later, additional reports indicated that Colt had leased the Norwood pasture lands near the Cone estate for a period of 5 years. What's curious about these news stories in 1896 is that they also appear to be Colt's first use of the label of colonel, perhaps in an effort to buoy his reputation among his new neighbors. Now, to clarify, the Norwood pasture lands were located to the west of what we think of as the Cone Manor area. And so this would have been basically in the vicinity of Rich Mountain and Trout Lake. From the beginning, Colt's time at Blowing Rock did not go well. In November, news broke in the Charlotte Observer that a hog belonging to Colt had broken free at his Blowing Rock farm and nearly devoured the 1-year-old son of John Springs, one of Colt's neighbors. 2 months later, on a trip to Norfolk, Colt was once again arrested, this time as an absconding debtor, when an old debt holder recognized Colt and demanded the outstanding $3,600 payment. Colt refused, claiming insolvency, apparently unaware that the prosecution already had a copy of his father's probate paperwork demonstrating his considerable assets. He was eventually released a few days later after reaching some sort of compromise with his debt holder. Later that year, the Charlotte press twice tried to connect Colt directly to the famous gunmaker Samuel Colt. First noting in June a lawsuit involving actual Samuel Colt descendants as something to, quote, be read with interest here as Charlotte's Colonel Colt is concerned, close quote. Then straight up called him, quote, the son of the revolver maker, close quote, in a bizarre story describing life at Blowing Rock and recounting a visit to Colt's house about 3 miles west of the village. Colt had a sawmill on the property as well as several barns and cattle stalls. He'd planted 700 acres in corn, cabbage, and buckwheat, and he was prepared to take 1,500 sheep and more than 2,000 chickens to market in the spring. Nevertheless, though, the Charlotte press seemed to denigrate Colt once again, overtly noting his fondness for drink by saying, quote, no corked up bottle contracts his hospitality, he sets it out in a pitcher, close quote, then mocked him for extolling his skills as a rattlesnake killer. 2 years later, in 1899, Colt was still farming at the Cone estate, almost certainly on the Norwood lands leased from Cone. But Colt wasn't like many of Cone's other tenants, who got free rent and a low wage in exchange for adherence to a strict moral code while working and living on the land. Instead, Colt's arrangement appears to have been a traditional land lease, with Colt permitted to live his life and do his work as he saw fit. The house itself sat on the side of a hill in an open field just below the fork in the trails leading to the top of Rich Mountain. And I'm hoping that you can see my cursor here on the screen. The Colt house is its center, where number 20 is. The Colt barn was up near 21, and then additional stalls at 22 and 23. And I believe the sawmill, if I recall correctly, was over in that same area. News reports suggested the entire family was living there full-time and that Cone had recently embraced goat rearing. But by October, something went sour, and Colt took his entire family back to the Beaufort house at Charlotte. A month later, he rented the buyer's residence on South Tryon Street, as a new home for his family. Fortunately, sources survive that show us what Cone's house and some of his outbuildings looked like, as well as tell us exactly why Colt was abandoning his leased house at the Norwood Lands on Cone Estate. It wasn't over liquor or wild parties or dead kids. On November 17, 1899, Cone's manager of the estate, Freeman L. Mulford, wrote in his diary, quote, "Saw Mr. Colt. He says he is going to leave. He has sold his small buildings and wants $150 for his barn," close quote. From the sound of things, Cone had built many of these structures himself on the leased land and expected to be compensated for them. Less than a week later, Mulford added, quote, "Mr. Brown and Mr. Underdown both here and spoke about Colt's tearing buildings all to pieces. Authorized Underdown to get Palmer to buy the buildings. Mr. Brown felt he was the best one that could have been selected to do it. Later, a letter from Mr. Cone authorizing us to go ahead. Mr. Palmer, in the meantime, bought the barn for $210, close quote. 2 weeks later, Mulford also reported that Colt was trying to sell the fencing on his place. Mulford telegraphed Cone, then took Cone's reply to confront Colt. Quote, Mr. Colt intimated he would leave fencing alone, but would cut out the dams, close quote. 3 days later, Mulford visited the Colt place again, although Colt himself was not mentioned. Quote, "No stock we want. Inside of barn needs rearranging. 3 windows broken in the house," close quote. In January, Mulford had the barn fumigated. Even 4 years after Colt's abandonment of his farming efforts at the Cone Estate, the Charlotte Press was still adding to Colt's mystique. In August 1903, in a Blowing Rock blurb ostensibly about the building of Moses Cone's famed carriage paths, the press noted that one of these trails passed directly by, quote, "Colonel R.O. Colt's still house," close quote. The article noted that Cone had still had 1 barrel of corn whiskey buried in the ground near the still, with about a year left before it would be ready, and that only Cone and, quote, "one other man," close quote, knew of its location. The story of Colt having a still at the Cone Estate has often been juxtaposed with Cone's alleged morally conservative outlook to lead some, like Altmeyer, to suggest that Colt was supplying whiskey to Cone's workers. And Cone drove Colt out by threatening to build a church next to Colt's house, prompting Colt to sell his property to Cone and, quote, "leave the state," close quote. All of this is absurd, of course, in large part because A, Colt went to Charlotte, not out of state, and continued to return to Blowing Rock frequently over the coming years, and B, Cone actively campaigned around the same time for whiskey sales in saloons, as demonstrated by a pamphlet entitled "An Open Answer to the 26 Reasons which Mr. Moses H. Cone Submits in Favor of Saloons from Blowing Rock, North Carolina." That publication can be found in the Blue Ridge Parkway archives. Even after Colt left Blowing Rock for Charlotte, though, the press once again found ways to ridicule him and his family. In early December 1901, the Charlotte Observer ran a bizarre article about a children's Wild West show held at the Colt residence on South Tryon Street. The key incident of the event involved Colt's 7-year-old daughter, Amy, and her reluctant cat, which Amy allegedly prodded into the performance area by repeatedly firing, quote, "the 6-mouthed namesake of her people," close quote, a Colt revolver filled with blank revolver cartridges. This stunt obviously terrified the cat to the point, as the press put it, of, quote, "being completely ruined for all domestic or religious purposes," close quote. Colt was not pleased by this coverage and immediately fired off a response to the paper, noting that Amy was, quote, "entirely too young to even handle a revolver," close quote. Couple these events with another that occurred at the Cone Estate in April 1900, just a few months after Colt abandoned his farming operations, and we can see how myths are born. Writing in his diary on April 10, 1900, Cone's farm manager Freeman Mulford noted, quote, "Mr. Waltzer buried his boy," close quote. While no death certificates are available for that period in Watauga County, this boy was likely the child of Spurgeon Walzer, David Walzer, or William Walzer, all of whom were farmers with young children and living near Blowing Rock in 1900.
The Walser tenant house, referred to in Mulford's diary, appears to have been just downhill from the Colt house, near the sawmill, based on contextual clues in Mulford's diary. I highlight these events because I believe they are the seeds for all of those rumors about gunplay and the tragic death of a Colt child at the Colt residence at Blowing Rock. Add to all of this that the Colts had already lost one child in 1894, plus Amy Colt died at the family home in Charlotte in 1916 at the young age of 21 from tuberculosis. I believe all of these elements, Colt's well-publicized tensions with Cone, his well-publicized farming efforts at the Cone estate, his family's decades-long association with Blowing Rock, this well-publicized incident involving the cat, and the death of the Walser boy just as Cone was abandoning Blowing Rock, and Amy Colt's later death, made for a better legend 3/4 of a century later when the truth was transmogrified in the minds and memories of people who had actually never known any of the Colts. Meanwhile, the press was still not done with Colt. At Christmas in 1901, the Charlotte News recounted another incident in which Colt had donned a drum major uniform and a coffee pot lid as a helmet to lead 3 children about his neighborhood in Charlotte, playing horns and drums to the tune of "Did You Ever See a Fly on the Wall?" Colt, meanwhile, passed his pot lid to collect cash, which he promptly returned to donors. The press excoriated, quote, Colonel Colt's mistake, close quote, attributing a quote to Colt in which he quipped that he should have given the money to the Thompson Orphanage, the rescue home, or the day nursery rather than return it to those who had donated. It got worse the next year, when newspapers all over the United States ran stories about a drunken Colt being slapped by a renowned actress after he had either accosted or made rude advances toward her on the street. This time, Colt was actually named as the son of Samuel Colt, quote, famous inventor of the Colt machine gun, close quote, whatever that was. Colt tried in vain to defend himself, writing to the Charlotte Observer to explain that he had accidentally stumbled into her on the crowded sidewalk in front of the Central Hotel on South Tryon Street, and that when he stepped in front of her and removed his hat to apologize, she slapped him. His note offered us perhaps our best insight into Colt's manner of viewing himself. Quote, as all of my acquaintances know, I am quite a nervous man. I was guilty of no improper conduct toward her, and I had only the design of explaining the unintentional character of my brushing against her and making her a respectful and gentlemanly apology, close quote. After the slapping incident, the press, curiously, shifted their attention toward effectively redeeming Colt's character, even as they continued to relay amusing stories about him. In November 1903, the press noted Colt's generosity in giving 15 Thanksgiving turkeys and trimmings to one local charity and 10 more to another. Quote, Colonel Colt has a heart in him many times bigger than his body, the Charlotte News wrote, and delights in such disinterested and unostentatious benefactions and remembrances. The milk of human kindness flows freely in his breast, and the unfortunate have in him a friend always. He is open-handed to a fault with his income, close quote. In 1904, the Charlotte Observer ran another blurb about Colt interrupting the performance of Count Mineralio and his pet monkey, Isabella, in front of the Central Hotel, much to the excitement and pleasure of the crowd, noting that Colt, quote, meant no harm, it was all in fun, and before the day was over, he slipped around and dropped $1 in little Isabella's tiny hat, close quote. Even a run-in with Charlotte authorities in 1905, apparently over a drunk driving incident, was dismissed by the press as a, quote, Star Chamber Inquisition, close quote, apparently unworthy of the court's time. When Colt's dog bit a neighbor's leg in 1906, the Charlotte News dismissed the event by making light of the fact that Colonel Colt finally had something vicious about him in his premises. A long 1907 blurb, picked up by several newspapers, offered a good-natured ribbing of Colt for the length of Colt's mustache. Excuse me. As part of the tale, Colt introduced the newspapermen to his friend who had brought cattle to market in Charlotte from Watauga County. Quote, "These are my newspaper friends, Woody," Colt said. "They are good fellows, and watch, they will write you up." Death came for Robert O. Colt II in August 1908 at the age of 47. No death certificate exists, and the local press attributed his death to a, quote, "long illness," close quote. The papers also gushed over Colt's character. The Charlotte News called him a man of charity who had, quote, "a roomy heart as big as the auditorium, with never any locks on the door and no reserved seats inside," close quote. They even got his actual lineage right, for the first time noting the significance of his father and his grandfather. Papers at home in Babylon briefly noted his connections to the area, then explained that he had lived for several years in the South, where he, quote, "was familiarly known as Colonel Colt," close quote. But the writers at the Charlotte Observer, long both the bane and the source of his popular existence, perhaps went furthest. Quote, "Colonel Colt had many friends among all classes. In fact, among those who understood him, he had no enemies. He never had a vicious thought in his life. Nervous and playful and restless was he when at home or on the streets. He was so sensitive that he would break down and cry like a child if anyone said a cruel word about him. He was often misunderstood, and his strange, hilarious ways sometimes got him in trouble, but he was well-meaning, kind, and respectable. Everybody teased him, but at the same time pitied and sympathized with him in his affliction. After coming to Charlotte 10 years ago, he was never well, but he kept going. He took an interest in the city and its people. The crying child, the suffering dog, or the fallen man of woman appealed to him. He was an enemy to himself, but a friend to his fellow man." The remaining members of the Colt family do not appear to have mourned him for long. Nearly a year to the day after his death, the obligatory mourning period for the time, Helen W. Colt packed up the kids and moved to Dresden, Germany, where she intended to have them educated. They returned to Charlotte a year later, in August 1910, and then spent subsequent summers in Blowing Rock, often taking up residence at the Watauga Inn and solidly establishing their status among the social set of summer residents at Blowing Rock. Their son, Robert Colt III, also summered at Blowing Rock when he wasn't busy at the new farm he purchased near Hickory. In the summer of 1913, Robert Colt III purchased the lot on Chestnut Street, although he waited to do anything with it. In 1915, he married Frances Russell, and after a long honeymoon tour through Mexico and the American West and South, they joined the rest of the family at the Watauga Inn. In January 1916, Colt engaged John Benfield to construct a handsome summer residence on the lot, although it's not clear when work actually began. Robert spent much of 1917 at Charlotte, likely because of the birth of his only child, Frances Russell Colt, in February of that year. But tragedy was never far from the lives of the Colt family. As we've already mentioned, Amy Colt died at the age of 21 in 1916, following a long trip with her brother. Tragedy struck again in October of 1918, when Robert O. Colt III succumbed to the effects of pneumonia from the pandemic influenza outbreak that year. He was just 29 years old. It's doubtful he ever spent any time at the home he had contemplated in Blowing Rock, and the death likely delayed construction, if it had begun at all. And once again, the papers dredged up the old myth that this branch of the family, of the Colt family, was directly descended from Samuel Colt of revolver fame. Helen W. Colt picked up where her son had left off, completing the summer cottage on Chestnut Circle in May 1919. For nearly 2 decades, she rented out rooms in the cottage and sometimes even offered the entire house, as she did in 1921 for $400, for the full season. By the late 1930s, though, Helen Colt was treating the house as her own summer home again. And after she died in 1941, the house passed to Robert O. Colt III's sister, Helen Colt Ramsey. She held the house until 1956, when she sold the property to the Rickert family, thus formally ending the Colt family's association with Blowing Rock. The story of Robert O. Colt II and his family's associations with Blowing Rock is one of my treasured professional stories. When we have weekend visitors to our home, we'll frequently take them for a hike up Rich Mountain. I like to pause where the Colt house once stood on the Cone estate and tell this bizarre story in relatively shortened form. But it came to me by accident because a client wanted to know more about the home they owned, and we never would have known the truth if that hadn't happened. It's a frequent reminder to me that we have an obligation to question and probe the stories we share, to vet them and explore the evidence behind them. Otherwise, they are nothing more than that: stories, legends, myths. And at that point, we might as well assume they are nothing more than fiction. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Hi, there was something at one point that you had mentioned about him where he called himself a rattlesnake killer. Was that a thing? What was that about?
So it's in that article where the reporter has come to visit Blowing Rock, and one of his stops is at Colt's house. And I think he was just kind of bragging because he was giving him a tour of the farm, basically. And I think he was just basically bragging about, having to kill rattlesnakes in order to get work done there. I think it's important to remember that this is the golden age of muckraking journalism. So they did not have the journalistic standards that we have today. And so it was fairly common to poke fun of the people you were writing about, or find their peccadillos, or even invent stories about them that would help sell papers. So I like to imagine that I do think that Colt was a little bit of a tale teller about himself, but I also like to imagine that this was as innocuous as, with sheep, I have to watch out all the time with the rattlesnakes around here, and I've probably killed 30 of them in the last year, something like that turned into making fun of him for being a rattlesnake killer. So.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you for your
Sure.
time today.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, thanks. I enjoyed that. And I want you to take on another Cone legend. And I want to know what's the real story behind the Chitola and the cones, because there's a wall that I've seen that physically exists that divides the Cone estate around Bass Lake and the beginning of the Chitola. And legend has it that there was a feud there between Bertha and whoever owned the property at the time, and she built the wall. Again, it's kind of lore and legend, and I'd love to know. Have you heard anything about that?
I don't know the story, but from what I know of Bertha, it would not surprise me. I think that's part of the problem with these kinds of stories, though, is, as we see in this case with the Colt family, given his run-ins with the law over time, it is not outlandish to imagine a wild party where he shoots his own son in the head one night, and the child dying and it being covered up. Similarly, Bertha does have, and there's a fair amount of evidence for it, a reputation for being very conservative, religiously and socially. And so I can imagine some feud emerging. Everything I've read about her was that she was a force to be reckoned with, we'll say. And I can imagine her deciding to spite a neighbor that much by erecting a wall to divide the property. But I don't have, I've not researched it, so I don't have any direct information about that. There's another interesting story about Moses Cone's remains being stolen from up there, and that one resurfaces from time to time. There is coverage of there being some sort of grave robbing incident, but I don't think it was from his specific grave site. I think it was just one of the graves up there was looted, I want to say it was the 19 teens, maybe the 1920s. So,
And then because of that, supposedly Moses is actually buried elsewhere on the state. If that's true,
right.
because they didn't want his grave to be vandalized again. But again, that's of lore and legend and
Right.
But I thank you for doing this. I had heard in my research about Cone stuff, I had heard about the Colt just as you presented it. So this is great.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions?
I just wanted to say I found that very engaging and humorous in certain parts. There was one of the slides towards the end had when it's talking about Robert O. Colt the third, I believe, building his home. I was trying to read that article, but I thought I saw Dangerfield on there, the name Dangerfield. I was wondering if they might have interacted, if there's any documentation of them interacting with like the Dangerfields up here, because if that house was built on Chestnut Circle, then it's probably pretty close to where Edgewood Cottage was.
Let me, so what the article says, I'll read it to you. It refers to Colt building in the vicinity of the David Craig property. And then there's, the article is summarizing several things happening in Blowing Rock. And then it goes on to say that Mr. Charles Moody is making considerable progress on the new Dangerfield buildings on the Will Clark Place, a handsome mansion, studio, and caretaker's lodge to be built in a group at a point on the Blue Ridge overlooking one of the grandest views in all the region. So I don't think it's directly related to the work that Colt III was doing. I think it's just here are several projects happening at once.
Mm-hmm.
And so Colt would have been engaging Benfield at the same time that Dangerfield was starting his work on those properties.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. And then I just wonder, just because some of these stories are so kind of outlandish about Robert O. Colt's behavior and kind of erratic and like describing him as being in a hilarious mood and things like that. I was wondering if maybe he might have had, a form of mental illness or something that was kind of spurring on that erratic behavior. If he said, if all of my friends who know me know that I'm a very nervous person,
Mm-hmm.
And then that might account for his eccentricities being picked up by the paper.
Right. And it was, it was fairly common in the late 19th century when you encountered, and we know this about mental health generally, that there was a tendency to attribute it to scandalous causes rather than it being something related to something more medical. So for example, I've seen many cases of women, for example, being described as hysterical when their actual symptoms are just normal medical symptoms that women experience at a particular time in life. And so that kind of thing happened. People who, he's a good example of somebody who had money. So the assumption would have been, well, he's got to be pretty normal if he's got money. So he's obviously drunk if he's behaving in this particular way. But there's also a fair amount of evidence from the articles I have that he drank a lot. And so I don't know how much of that is sort of for lack of a better term, a frat boy mentality of, I've got money and I can do whatever I want when I'm drunk and it's never going to really matter, or if it was just some combination of, as you suggest, a mental health issue in combination with maybe having a little too much to drink. Hard to say.
Yeah, hard to say. And then just if there's not like coroner's reports, you can't really tell like what he died of with that illness. Could it have been like liver failure or cirrhosis or something if he was an alcoholic, being that long-term illness? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this has just been a wonderful kind of glimpse into the history of Blowing Rock and a part that we don't really get to hear about. So Dr. Plaag, I really appreciate you taking some time out this morning to share these stories with us. And I will definitely find some other topics to get you back here. I'd love to have kind of like a standing thing, maybe once a quarter or something, we get you here to share what you got going on with Digital Watauga.
All righty, sounds good. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks everybody for attending today.